Now, first of all today, police are investigating the collapse of Sergei Skripal, a former Russian agent convicted of spying for Britain, who was found unconscious on a bench at a shopping centre on Sunday. Investigators are trying to identify what substance left the Russian, who was granted refuge in the UK in 2010 under a spy swap, and a woman understood to be his daughter critically ill in hospital. The pair had no visible injuries, and a number of locations in the city centre were cordoned off, while teams in protective gear have used hoses to decontaminate the street. The possibility of an unexplained substance being involved has drawn comparisons with the 2006 poisoning of the Russian dissident Alexander Litvinenko. Well, to find out more, let's speak to our correspondent there, Leila Nathu, and she's in Salisbury. Leila, what's the latest that we know about Mr. Skripal and the woman that was with him?
Well, Joe, we now understand that the woman who was with Sergei Skripal when they collapsed just behind me here on that bench that's currently covered by a tent is in fact his daughter, Yulia. Now, police so far have refused to confirm the identities of the two, describing them only as a 66-year-old man and 33-year-old woman. But we now know that it is Sergei Skripal and his daughter who are still in a critical condition in hospital. Now, just briefly, some background on Yulia. She moved to the UK with Sergei Skripal in 2010 when he was brought over to the UK in that swap. She then moved back to Moscow, but it's understood that she visited her father regularly here in Salisbury in recent years, and she'd recently left Moscow as well to come here to visit him. She also had a brother who, it's understood, died in St. Petersburg last year. And the family now believe that that is suspicious. And the family are at pains to say that they do not believe Sergei Skripal was a spy for MI6, as the Russians allege, and for those charges that he was imprisoned on in 2006. But police so far are not entertaining any of those strands of inquiry. They are not engaging with that at all. They have simply said they are investigating what happened here. They are looking into how the two became unconscious on this belt. We understand they are examining some CCTV footage that was retrieved from nearby that shows a man and a woman walking just where I am now, and they are trying to piece together the lead up really to the couple being found unconscious here.
Leila, have you any sense from the police or doctors when we can expect the results of what the substance was that killed them?
No, not as yet. They are still describing the substance as unknown,
yes.
But they are at pains to say that there is no risk to the wider public now. They do not believe there is any risk. We have confirmation that a couple of police officers had been admitted to hospital with minor symptoms. They have now been discharged, and it's understood only one emergency service personnel is now still in hospital, but just with minor symptoms, some reported to be itchy eyes or wheeziness. So no wider risk to the public. But certainly the results of those toxicology tests will be key to the police inquiry to ascertain exactly what they took and how it might have been ingested or inhaled. Now, there are a couple of cordons, a restaurant, a high street Italian chain restaurant just a few hundred metres away now has been called off. A nearby pub has too. So clearly trying to piece together the last movements before those couple were found slumped and almost comatose, according to eyewitnesses, just a few metres behind me.
Leila Nathu, thank you. Before we move on, I must correct the mistake I just made. They are critically ill at the moment. They are not yet dead. Now, we're joined now by BBC Newsnight's diplomatic editor Mark Urban and the Labour MP Chris Bryant. Welcome to both of you. Mark Urban, what's your sense of what's happened?
Well, it's hard to go beyond those sketchy outlines. And of course, I think one should always hesitate to rush to judgment in a case like this until clearly there is some clear evidence from the hospital of what substance may have brought those two people to this state. But one thing we can know quite clearly is that there is form. We know about the Litvinenko case. We also know about a case that we exposed on Newsnight more than 10 years ago, where MI5 assessed that a hit team was being sent to the UK to kill Boris Berezovsky, the Russian millionaire, now also dead. But they stopped it happening. We also know about the mysterious poisoning of a Russian businessman in Weybridge. So there's quite a lot of circumstantial evidence that there is some kind of policy or practice of attacking and poisoning people in exile in order to send a message.
Are people rushing to judgment here, Chris Bryant, in terms of talking about hostile intent, as the Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson has said, before we actually know what's happened?
I don't know that he said that in relation to this, has he? He said that in relation to other
He said it yesterday.
signs in relation to this?
Well, more broadly.
But I think he was referring to something completely different, and I think that's important. We need, of course, Mark is absolutely right to say that we've got to look at the wider picture of Russian engagement, and it is true that Putin's personal record is regularly to resort to excessive violence. Think of Beslan, think of the Moscow theatre siege, think of Georgia, Ukraine, Crimea. I mean, you know, take your pick. And also large numbers of journalists like Anna Politkovskaya, or for that matter, Sergei Magnitsky, working for British bank, murdered in Russia. So it is a long list, and my anxiety, you're absolutely right, we shouldn't jump to conclusions, but we need to make sure that when we do investigate, we investigate thoroughly. And my anxiety is that over the last few years, I think Theresa May and David Cameron, both as Prime Minister, were culpable in not allowing sufficient investigation. Theresa May, after Litvinenko, wrote saying she refused to have an inquiry because she said she thought that the Kremlin might misunderstand that. Now, I think we have been allowing the Russians to get away with murder on our soil too frequently recently, and we need to put a stop to it. It's in our national security interests.
Teresa Villiers, what do you say to that? Has there been a lack of grit on the side of the British to investigate these things?
No, absolutely not. I mean, all these cases, I'm sure, have been very thoroughly investigated by the police, and as you acknowledge, there was a full-scale inquiry into the death of Litvinenko.
Way too late.
So
and what did we do after the inquiry? Nothing.
I think it is right that not to rush to judgment. I think that the police obviously will be approaching this with an open mind, and if it does turn out that there is a connection with the Russian state, obviously that would be wholly unacceptable and would have a major damaging effect on the relations between the UK and Russia.
Right. Hang on, Chris. I mean, Russia has said it has no information about this, and that the Kremlin is willing to cooperate. But on the basis of you accusing previous governments of not quite doing enough, let's have a listen to the Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott.
I will be writing to Amber Rudd to say that if it does prove to be the case that the Russian state is involved in this latest death, what assurances can she give, both about the rigour of the investigation and where we go from here? I don't like defaulting to a red menace analysis, but we can't allow London and the home counties to become a kind of killing field.
That's Diane Abbott. Mark Owen, what do you make of the Russian response?
Well, self-evidently, if they did have any involvement, they're not going to admit it. I mean, I think the key thing here that we can see for the government is that this is a fiendishly difficult issue for them. We know in the past that both in the case of Litvinenko and in the case that I mentioned before of this attempt to kill Boris Berezovsky, the official assessment in the security service, just a couple of buildings down Millbank here, was that this was Russian state action. Now, that kind of assessment remains highly classified. People in Whitehall were very annoyed with us when we publicised it in the case of the Berezovsky thing. The reason, of course, is that once you bring that out into the open, it demands action, it demands a response. And that is an extremely difficult thing to do, because these plots, by their nature, except when you use something as esoteric as polonium, where you can then give a forensic line, a forensic chain back to a Russian government establishment, they are deniable. And it's self-evident that nobody is going to claim such an attack if indeed that's what's happened in Salisbury, because the purpose of it is to send a message.
Right, and what action could the British government take? How do you intensify pressure on Russia, which arguably has actually led to the Russian response being tougher? I mean, they've sort of stiffened their resolve, claims of being humiliated by Britain. So what would you suggest? Can
I just go back one step and then I'll answer your question, which is to say that actually it's not just the private security view, it was also the public inquiry. The judge came to the conclusion that this was not only state sanctioned, that but that it was personally sanctioned by President Putin. And what did we do? What did Theresa May do? She shrugged her shoulder. We did absolutely nothing. And I think what people like Putin learn from moments like that is they go, well, impunity, we can just do what we want.
So what would you do?
Well, first of all, one of the things we could have done, and I've been arguing for a long time that we should have done, is that we should have the same laws in the Magnitsky Law, which applies in the United States of America and in Canada and the Netherlands and various other countries as well. I simply don't understand why Cameron and Theresa May repeatedly have refused to implement that in the UK. They've got another chance coming up in the next few weeks. Once we've got the full, we will need to have a full public inquiry into what has happened in this particular circumstance. And I'm sorry, the reason I spoke over you, Theresa, earlier is because I don't think there have been full investigations in some of the cases. I simply don't believe that all these 13 Russians who are opponents of Putin who've died in this country all personally just suddenly decided to commit suicide. I just don't believe that.
Are you really saying that somehow the police are under pressure not to investigate death on our streets just because of diplomatic reasons? I cannot believe that for a moment. That's the stuff of conspiracy theories. We've got some of the most effective police in the world. They are going to investigate every case, including today's shocking events, and I cannot believe that wider international considerations is ever going to get in the way of the police doing their job thoroughly of investigating these attacks on individuals.
The information I have from security staff is that quite often what happens in some of these cases is that the first view is taken very, very quickly, and suicide is thought as a convenient means of avoiding the dangers of imperiling the diplomatic situation.
Right. What happens now then in terms of the investigation?
Look, I think you work a case like this from numerous angles, don't you? I mean, if, as we believe, his daughter came over, there was family reasons for her to come over to be with her dad last week, you analyse things like the CCTV, her travel plans, is there any evidence that she was followed? Of course, looking at if the assumption now is shifting towards was some kind of poison administered in a restaurant or nearby in the park where they fell ill, CCTV analysis once again, who is visible, is there somebody who arouses suspicion as being somebody who approached them or was very close to them, was in a position to do that. There are so many different lines of inquiry that the police will be looking at, and of course underlying it all, the fight to save their lives in hospital and establish what it is that has made them so ill.
I mean, you won't be surprised, obviously, by the fact that the Russians are criticising the coverage here in the UK, and I presume they will pretty well stick to those lines.
Look, inevitably, and in a sense, at the moment, you can say, why not? I mean, there is no evidence of a state attempt to poison Colonel Skripal and his daughter as yet. The problem is, I think, from a Russian point of view and from a messaging point of view, is that they've got form.
And it's just worth, you know, if somebody was involved, like Andrew Lugovoy, we think murdered Alexander Litvinenko, was involved, we won't be able to, you know, he got back to Russia very quickly, and of course the Russian state law refuses to allow the extradition of any Russian citizen. Likewise, Russian state law says that there is impunity for any Russian operative murdering somebody in another country who is considered to be a traitor to Russia. So, I mean, it's just very clear. It's a publicly declared intent to do this. And if you look around the world, it's a very, very, very long list at the moment. And I just think that President Putin wanted to press the reset button with Putin. It didn't work. He got nothing out of it. David Cameron wanted to do the same, wanted to do more trade with Russia. It didn't work. We need to be walking into this with our eyes wide open.
Right. Well, the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, will